When doing any kind of discussion on Blue Lock episode Nagi, there's one fact that we can't get around. Episode Nagi is a spin-off, a retelling of the Blue Lock story from another point of view. It serves to supplement the main story, but also provides an alternative spin on familiar events. But as literary critic, I'm not satisfied to reduce this manga to a fun little side project that merely shows us some stuff that wasn't covered in the main story. Instead, I want to examine episode Nagi as a profoundly intertextual work, one that presupposes a deep level of familiarity with the primary material to make sense of its contents. So let's take the challenge seriously of interpreting episode Nagi as a spin-off, one that generates a tremendous amount of meaning through its consistent engagement with its source material, and I guarantee that this will make episode Nagi even more interesting as a result. Hello, my name is Sean, and while this video was a real struggle to write, I think the result has been worth it. Also, if you like what I do, consider signing up to my Patreon. For one, you'll help me cover channel-related expenses, but on top of that, you also gain access to my podcast where I give my first thoughts on a new Blue Lock chapter every single week. Over the years, I've been asked quite a few times if I read episode Nagi. It's always been interesting to me that viewers didn't assume I would do so. Like, I run a Blue Lock channel and all. But in all fairness, I understand where the question is coming from. I mention it so little that if your only knowledge of Blue Lock comes from watching my videos, you'd be forgiven for not even realizing that the spin-off exists. My reason for not engaging with episode Nagi will likely ruffle a few feathers, and it's completely fine if you disagree with me here. On a fundamental level, what I try to do on this channel is interpret the Blue Lock manga as a work of literature. That means that I care deeply about not just what happens in the story, but also how the events are presented to us and what implications that carries. Let me list a few examples of questions that Blue Lock's presentation invites us to ponder. Why is Nagi's downfall in the NEL presented as the B-plot to the main storyline of Isagi becoming number 1? Why are we shown a match in the third selection that doesn't feature Isagi? And why is that told from Reo's POV? Why do we learn about Team Nigeria's past through 4 separate flashbacks scattered throughout their match against Japan? To me, these are all deeply interesting questions, but more than that, these are questions that can't be answered by just accumulating lore and trivia. Like, the Blue Lock Wiki is a great resource, but I'd be hard-pressed to argue that an unfiltered amalgamation of data holds any artistic merit. Rather, a series of events acquires literary value through the process of selection and presentation. For instance, episode Nagi features an Ego speech about knowledge of death that doesn't appear in the main story. This is no accident. Rather, Ego's speech serves as a programmatic statement that ties together a whole series of metaphors and ideas throughout episode Nagi specifically. And that's something I'll get back to towards the end of the video. Just imagine that the main story had cut to Ego giving this speech to Nagi's team right after they stepped out of the gate at the end of the second selection. Or if we got an Ego speech about death in place of his explanation about the nature of luck, which capped off the last 4v4 in the main story. That would be completely incoherent storytelling, wouldn't it? Let me put it differently. Blue Lock is presumably the story of how Yoichi Isagi becomes the world's best striker after being exposed to Jinpachi Ego's radical football philosophy. If the manga hasn't told this story completely, perfectly, and coherently by the time we reach the final chapter, Blue Lock will have failed as a work of literature. Very simply put, the integrity of the Blue Lock manga would be severely compromised if readers had to consult some spin-off to complete its story. Just imagine that Blue Lock had never showed us the U20 match in the main story, but featured it in a light novel or something. Readers would be outraged, and rightfully so. The most famous ancient Greek textual critic, Aristarchus, is believed to have formulated the maxim Homeron ex Homeru sapheniste, to interpret Homer from Homer. Aristarchus wrote commentaries about the Homeric epics where he attempted to clarify uncertainties about the text or interpretation of select passages. His maxim seems to set out a methodological axiom that you must answer such questions through recourse to other Homeric material rather than consulting different texts. This is roughly the principle I follow in my Blue Lock analysis videos as well. To me, when I'm interpreting the main story, episode Nagi is basically fanfic. Now, I'm well aware of the irony of starting a video on episode Nagi by explaining why I don't engage with episode Nagi. But I guess what I want to make clear with this meander and preamble is that episode Nagi, in its capacity as a spin-off, requires a fundamentally different interpretative approach compared to the main story. Episode Nagi is a manga that can only exist in reflection and refraction, one that presumes knowledge of the main story for its plot to even make sense. And that's really what I want to do in this video. Examine how episode Nagi generates meaning through its status as a spin-off. As a work of derivative art, episode Nagi actively invites readers to compare and contrast its contents to the main Blue Lock manga, and find meaningful interpretations of the gaps and differences. Let me start with one of my favorite examples of how episode Nagi engages with the main story. This is specifically in its portrayal of the 3v3 in the second selection, where Isagi, Nagi and Barou face off against Reo, Chigiri and Kunigami. Let me just start with a very basic observation. If you were to read this match without knowledge of the main story, its ending is completely bizarre. From the episode Nagi POV, Barou just pulls a new move out of his ass and suddenly devours the entire field. This is exacerbated by the fact that the match is focalized almost exclusively from Reo's point of view. The main purpose of this match in episode Nagi is showing how Reo gradually comes to understand what makes Isagi unique and why Nagi would choose Isagi over him. We witness how Reo goes from underestimating Isagi's talents to acknowledging his true nature. This means that episode Nagi's dramatic framing of the match is very different from its counterpart in the main story. In the original version, the 3v3 revolved around the conflict between Isagi and Barou and the question of how to coexist as fellow egoists. Every scene in the match focuses on this specific tension. That's why its ending also feels so satisfying. Barou and Isagi reciprocally devouring each other is an unexpected yet coherent resolution that is completely in line with the themes of this unhinged football comic. With this in mind, episode Nagi's rendition of the same match is really fascinating. It leverages our pre-existing knowledge about the themes of the 3v3 in the main story to inform our interpretation of the events in the spin-off. To explain what I mean by this, I want to turn to Isagi vs Barou once more. In the main story, their conflict is explicitly framed as a power struggle. The reason why two egoists like Isagi and Barou clash is because both of them are trying to enact their will, their ego, upon their teammates. What we witness in this match is a battle for dominance, for control, between two competing kings, to the extent that Isagi's crowning achievement is to make Barou bow down in submission. That brings me to the counterpart in episode Nagi. Let's start with Reo's very first character moment in the match, a scene that appears in both the main story and episode Nagi for what it's worth. Reo's assertion that he will steal back Nagi, who he sees as his rightful property. So, if we're thinking of this as a match about control and kingship, we see a variation on theme in Reo. He too considers himself someone with the right to bend others to his whim. He too sees this match as an opportunity to assert dominance. And just like Barou at his lowest point, Reo fails to enact his will upon the world and finds himself subjected to the whims of others instead. To put it simply, Reo's character in the main story serves as a subtle variation on theme, as another example of a failed king. So then, when we turn to episode Nagi, we see that the spin-off expands this latent idea to its full potential. Firstly, let's talk about the way Reo positions himself vis-a-vis Isagi. Reo is a super elite, the cream of the crop, who reiterates throughout the match that he'll demonstrate his superiority over Isagi. Note also how startlingly similar this is to Barou's flashback in the same match. Barou is defined by how he grew up in a league of his own, just as how Reo asserts himself as a cut above the common rabble in the spin-off. This all culminates in the scene where Reo realizes that he's doing to Nagi what his father previously did to him. And if you think about it, this is a really interesting moment for Reo to have this realization. After all, what does Reo's father represent? As the CEO of a major business conglomerate, Reo's father is a ruler of sorts in his own right, who believes that everything in the world belongs to him. This mentality is reflected in the way he exercises complete control over his son, treating him like a puppet in his own ambitions. In other words, Reo rebels against his father for the exact same reasons that Barou refuses to collaborate with Isagi. A true egoist will not be controlled by another person. But at the same time, both Reo and Barou are trying to bend others to their will as well, and in both cases, this actively prevents them from effectively collaborating with others. In fact, the spin-off parallels Reo and Barou on another front as well. It weaves Reo into the imagery of light and darkness, which is the central metaphor of the 3v3 in the main story. The Blue Lock manga embeds its main conflict in a recurrent contrast between Isagi's shining light and Barou, clad in a veil of darkness. In response, episode Nagi aligns Reo with Barou's darkness. Over the course of the match, he comes to recognize Isagi's light and subsequently vies to extinguish this shining future. So why are we getting all these tantalizing parallels between Reo and Barou? It's because in the spin-off, Reo effectively undergoes an identical development as Barou in the main story. Both players enter the match with an uncompromising desire to impose their will upon others, but they soon find their efforts thoroughly repudiated. And as the curtains fall, both are forced to accept that they can't be reborn without destroying their old mindset. Reo even comes to realize this by witnessing Barou's awakening, by seeing a kindred spirit do what he still cannot. So let's distill some general observations from all this. Episode Nagi's rendition of the 3v3 is not just a retelling of the main story from a different point of view. Rather, it actively invites us to read a crucial moment from Reo's character journey against its main story context and all the ideas therein. In this case, the struggle for dominance between Isagi and Barou. The spin-off thereby draws on our pre-existing familiarity with the main story context to inform our interpretation of Nagi and Reo's stories and integrate them into Blue Lock's broader thematic messaging. Let's talk about another match from the spin-off that becomes more interesting when we read it against its main story counterparts, the match against the Wanima twins from Team W. So again, let's establish the main story context. On a foundational level, the Wanima brothers offer a simple yet effective juxtaposition to the fallout in Team Z, where the opposing team is led by identical twins whose every move is perfectly in sync. Our protagonists are stabbed in the back by one of their own, but then they're saved at the last minute by the one person who had done nothing to earn their trust. Crucially, we discover that Chigiri couldn't be relied on at first because he himself had lost faith in his abilities. That is, until Isagi reminded him of what it means to trust in your own ambitions. In short, the Team W match provides several angles on a closely interrelated series of themes, including trust, cooperation, and loyalty. That brings us to the match where Nagi's team faces off against the same opponents. And interestingly enough, the spin-off touches on very similar ideas in its own narrative context. Just as for Team Z in the main story, the first selection of the spin-off is the tale of how an eccentric cast of characters finally comes together as a functional team. Most relevant for our purposes, the scenes before the contest against Team W hone in on Zantetsu's relationship with Reo and Nagi. On the one hand, it establishes the lack of respect between Zantetsu and Reo, which prevents them from establishing an effective working relationship. And on the flip side, we see Nagi grow closer with Zantetsu, and here he expresses his reasons for trusting in Reo. It's no coincidence then that the match against Team W is where Reo and Zantetsu finally start trusting each other and cooperating. And as a result, Team V comes out on top because their aces surpass their opponents in sheer chemistry. Also, as an additional soft parallel, in both matches, Team W is defeated once an extraordinary striker starts to trust his teammates. By this point, I hope that you'll agree with me that reading episode Nagi against the contents of the main story actually imparts additional significance to the events of the spin-off. So now, I want to move from more localized parallels to some of the most important structural engagement between these two stories. To do so, let's start at the very beginning. Both manga open with a programmatic proclamation that encapsulates the central thematic thesis of each respective story. Blue Lock's very first chapter begins and concludes with a simple observation. While goalkeepers, defenders and midfielders can be raised, first-class strikers will suddenly appear wherever the game is at its hottest. This claim is immediately demonstrated in the same chapter. A contrarian maverick creates the hottest football environment in the entire world, and out of nowhere, the future world's best comes charging through the masses, declaring that he's a true striker. Moreover, the manga repeatedly demonstrates that none of its latent ego as strikers could have emerged on their own. This is best exemplified through the figure of Isagi in chapter 1, whose talents were stifled by growing up in a tepid environment. Yet, throughout the story, we're shown that this rings true for all its other major characters. In short, Blue Lock's first chapter explicitly links the emergence of the world's best striker to the physical environment in which its events unfold. So, let's now turn to the opening and closing statements of episode Nagi's first chapter, because these become tremendously interesting when read against their counterparts in the main story. In my view, a comparison of these two opening statements really puts into focus what kind of story episode Nagi will be telling. Chapter 1 of the spin-off begins with the following quote: "Prodigies never come into being on their own. They only take shape when someone discovers them for the first time." The opening statements of the two manga are more than just interesting quotes though. They actually reflect the very structure of their respective manga. The main story puts its environment front and center. This is a narrative about the place where football is at its hottest, in the Blue Lock facility. But Blue Lock is not just a physical space. It's also a regimented training program for producing prospective strikers. That's why the main story matches are consistently interspliced with pearls of wisdom from Blue Lock's mastermind. From its very inception, this manga documents the step-by-step process behind the emergence of the world's best striker. Episode Nagi, on the other hand, is a story about how world-class strikers can only come into being through their relationship with other people. This is a claim I can't fully substantiate here, but don't worry, I'll be putting out a separate video on this very topic soon. However, the validity of the spin-off's programmatic statement is already demonstrated in its very first pages. Our alleged prodigy is wasting away in an empty, unfulfilling life, believing that everything is a pain. And this is figurized in a ludicrously literal way. He starts his day by pricking a cactus. I mean, it's no wonder that you think life is a pain if that's your daily ritual. That is, until he's approached by the person who will change the course of his life forever. And where the spin-off begins with a fateful meeting, it ends with Reo bringing about the conditions for Nagi to demonstrate his superhuman aptitude for football. In fact, the first chapter of episode Nagi doesn't even feature them entering Blue Lock at all, in direct contrast to the main story, which commences with the inception of the Blue Lock program. It's highly significant as well that episode Nagi's opening statement doesn't get reiterated towards the end of the chapter. Rather, it gets repeated when Nagi encounters Isagi for the first time. And by returning to the programmatic declaration in the second pivotal meeting, the spin-off underscores that this is a story about how a person is shaped not by their environment, but by the human beings around them. Crucially still, episode Nagi's first chapter ends with an additional statement. This is the story about how Nagi the prodigy discovered the fire of egotism. The opening and closing claims are of course closely interconnected. The central thematic conceit of this spin-off is that Nagi discovers his fire by forging relationships with those around him. So here's where it gets really interesting. Fire is very consciously evoked as a central metaphor of both the main story and the spin-off. The Japanese even uses the same key term, the same kanji, in the two passages. However, where the central conceit of the main story is that world-class strikers manifest in a heated environment, the spin-off focuses on how someone can get fired up by the people around them. And through this alone, episode Nagi sets out its position in relation to the main Blue Lock manga. The spin-off is, in essence, a story about the exact same process, about someone getting fired up. However, the two manga distinguish themselves from each other by having their protagonist enter this fiery state through very different means. The seminal difference between the two stories also goes a long way to explain why the scope of episode Nagi is exactly what it is. Why episode Nagi ends at the start of the third selection. For example, take the Nagi storyline after his elimination from Blue Lock. When Nagi comes to the realization that he wants to return to his old fired up self, he decides to cycle to the Blue Lock facility, the physical space where the fire rages fiercely. This makes perfect sense within the thematic context of the main story. Here, Nagi finally understood that he was able to flourish because he was part of the Blue Lock program, as has been the manga's central conceit ever since its second page. However, such a scene would be completely incongruent within the thematic framework of episode Nagi. After all, Nagi's voyage goes against the spin-off's core message, that Nagi's inner fire was kindled by his connection to others. With this, I obviously don't want to suggest that Jinpachi Ego's training program didn't play a crucial role in awakening Nagi's ego. However, the full summary of the life and times of Seishiro Nagi is not a narrative. That's a page on the Blue Lock wiki. Instead, episode Nagi serves to complement the main story, not just by depicting events that weren't shown in the original, but more fundamentally through a narrative that offers an alternative spin on Blue Lock's central thematic conceit. Now, if we're talking about episode Nagi as a variation on theme of the main story, there's a scene that really jumps out to me on this front. This is in chapter 2, where Jinpachi Ego gives his speech that only the greatest egoist can become the world's best striker. Here, he gives a concrete example of the kind of egoist he's trying to cultivate, one that clearly resonates with Isagi's prior experiences. The main story then visualizes Isagi noticing an unspecified teammate who is perfectly positioned to score the pivotal goal. In this account of events, the anonymity is part of the point. In Blue Lock's Japan, playing football means being subsumed into an amorphous collective. Japanese culture requires an individual to relinquish their chance to fulfill their personal desires to anyone, no matter their prior history or relationship. In fact, it's quite noteworthy that in the scene of Isagi failing to qualify for nationals, we never learn anything about Tada's abilities as a striker. Isagi doesn't pass to Tada because his teammate has what it takes, but rather because he follows his team's vaguely defined mantra, one for all. So, when the main story visualizes Isagi facing the exact same dilemma during Ego's speech, it very deliberately doesn't show Tada or any other familiar face by his side. After all, if we'd seen Tada, we readers could make an informed assessment. Isagi shouldn't pass to his former teammate because Tada doesn't pull through in clutch moments. Instead, the framing of this scene suggests that in Japanese football, surrendering one's individuality is an end in its own right. It's where a player has to privilege the harmony of the team as a whole. This is very different when we turn to the counterpart in the spin-off. Here, we see Nagi being approached not by some random nobody, but by his closest friend. So when Ego asks his invitees to indulge in their own desires at the expense of their teammates, or the team as a whole, the spin-off reframes this as a moment of profound betrayal. In this fantasy, Nagi is not just jeopardizing the hopes of the nation, but more pertinently, his dearest relationship. Moreover, this moment is part of a wider pattern of dramatic irony about Nagi and Reo's impending separation. And viewed from this lens, episode Nagi completely reframes our interpretation of the original scene. In the main story, Isagi's wholehearted embrace of his ego is cast as a transformative moment of victory, the downtrodden individual finally asserting the primacy of his own desires. Episode Nagi, on the other hand, brings into full focus the interpersonal quandaries that arise from wholeheartedly committing to unselfish impulses. And just as a side note here, one of the coolest bits about doing this video for me was that it made me ask questions I'd never asked before about moments in the main story. This last one was a prime example. I never really gave it much thought that Isagi was depicted with his anonymous teammates. But then, its counterpart in episode Nagi did something completely different, which caused me to question why the main story is the way it is. And to me, the way the spin-off defamiliarized myself with scenes I'd examined so many times before has been really stimulating. Anyways, episode Nagi incessantly highlights the tension between fueling one's passions versus maintaining relationships with others. Just a few pages later, Eiko already challenges Reo's claim that he and Nagi can become the world's best together. This of course culminates in the most pivotal moment of the spin-off: Nagi abandoning Reo, choosing his fire over his former partner. But at the same time, the spin-off also makes it clear that Nagi's fire is deeply connected to the people around him, with Nagi's final victory seeing him become fired up without relying on others for the first time. This is a bit of a side tangent again, but then again, this entire video is just a series of tangents anyways. In the final 4v4 of episode Nagi, right before our protagonist finally becomes fired up on his own accord, we get a very deliberate callback to Chigiri's awakening in the main story. It's even got the chain imagery and all. So why focus on Chigiri's character in particular at this specific moment? In the last major match of the spin-off, Nagi expresses his desire to realize his dream for the first time, and as he comes to see the value of chasing after your dreams, he finally comprehends the severity of what he did to Reo, that he seemingly abandoned their shared dream. That brings us back to Chigiri. In the main story, Chigiri had initially given up on his dream. However, he ends up realizing that he can't experience fulfillment unless he puts his body on the line and reignites his fire, that he must keep running until his dream becomes reality. So, on a very basic level, Chigiri is a perfect foil for Nagi in the earlier parts of the match. This comes out most clearly when Nagi tries to stop Chigiri from overextending himself. At this stage, Nagi still fails to understand why Chigiri would push himself so hard. In fact, the paneling of the scene where Nagi tells Chigiri to stop chasing Himizu stands in a direct juxtaposition to the scene from the first selection in the main story, where Isagi orders Chigiri to start running. Back in the main story, this is the moment that led Chigiri to realize what he'd given up and led him to dream of becoming the world's best striker one more time. So if we then turn to Nagi, we see history repeating itself on a smaller scale. Just as how he had trampled on Reo's dream at the start of the second selection, he is now telling Chigiri to forsake his near the arc's conclusion. But now, we get the moment that breaks the cycle. It's where Chigiri convinces Nagi that any sacrifice is worth making to fulfill your dreams. This is basically Chigiri's full circle moment, where he does to Nagi what Isagi had previously done to him. And fascinatingly enough, this is reinforced through a shared visual metaphor. Earlier in the story, Nagi had bound Reo's heart in chains by seemingly abandoning their shared dream. And then, in the 4v4, Chigiri liberates himself from his chains as he reaffirms his conviction to his dreams. The same chains that had represented his fear of losing his dream in the main story. And that's the moment that spurs on Nagi to give shape to his dreams in turn. Let me take this reading one step further. Time and again, episode Nagi returns to the question of whether one's dreams and fire can coexist with maintaining connections to other people. Whether it was inevitable for Nagi to move on from Reo to become his best self. This is also the moment that the Chigiri character moment taps into. Chigiri chastises Nagi for caring about the people around him, for subordinating his ego to the needs of others. The point appears clear. The path of an egoist involves sacrificing everything on the altar of greatness. That is, after all, what Chigiri's character represents. The willingness to risk everything he has to offer in pursuit of this ecstatic pleasure. And by implication, it's a retroactive justification for Nagi electing the rage and fire of his ego over his relationship with Reo. However, the conclusion of the match makes it clear that episode Nagi is not a story about recklessly abandoning your established connections. In fact, the chapter where Nagi's team decides to bundle their unrealized dreams for the match opens with a flashback to Reo establishing his shared dream with Nagi. So, at least within the dramatic framework of episode Nagi, we've understood that Nagi's dream is to win the World Cup with Reo. And that's regardless of the value that dream holds in light of later main story developments. And here is where I think the connection with Chigiri and sacrifice comes out in full. For Chigiri, the main story establishes that the ecstasy of breaking past his opponents is the specific manifestation of his dream. So, putting it differently, the paradox of Chigiri's character is that he can only chase after this dream by risking the very leg that lets him contend for the title of world's best in the first place. So, what I want to suggest here is that in the 4v4, the same is shown to apply to Nagi. If Nagi's dream is tied to his relationship with Reo, he similarly had to threaten its foundation before he could realize this shared dream. That's why Nagi could only understand the full significance of having dreams upon witnessing the sacrifices that Chigiri was willing to make. Also, for those who hadn't caught it yet, the spreads of Nagi's winning goal in the 4v4 are direct parallels to Isagi's winning goal in the U20 match. You know, the culmination of everything Isagi had learned during the first part of the story. So with this visual shorthand, the spin-off positions Nagi's goal in the 4v4 as the structural counterpart to the most impactful moment of Isagi's life. And that makes perfect sense if we look at the thematic scope of episode Nagi. Its inciting instant, the moment where a hero is lifted from his mundane reality into the electrifying world of football, is where Reo declares his new dream to Nagi. So, just as how all Isagi's trials and tribulations equipped him with the ability to score the winning goal of the U20 match, so does Nagi's growth as a person finally enable him to kindle the fire of his shared dream. Now, I've been talking about a lot of points of contact between episode Nagi and the main story, but there's one humongous elephant in the room that I've kind of skirted around so far. Nagi's eventual elimination from Blue Lock. Now, I realize that most everyone watching this video on its initial upload has probably been a weekly manga reader for quite a while, but some things might be helpful to clarify for future viewers. Episode Nagi was published concurrently with the Neo Egoist League arc in the main story. During its run, readers would commonly draw parallels between the contents of the spin-off and the ongoing developments in the NEL. The most blatant point of contact was probably chapter 34, where Nagi expresses his fear about his fire disappearing, and Loki predicts that this fear will eventually break him. That chapter dropped in May 2025, just a month after Nagi lost his fire and succumbed to fear in the main story. And I'm positively certain that Kaneshiro aligned the publication dates of these chapters very deliberately. But there are also many other interesting examples of how main story events shape our interpretation of episode Nagi. For example, the chapter featuring Hiragi's tarot reading dropped in January 2024, shortly after the conclusion of the Ubers match. And with those events fresh in mind, it's hard not to read the reference to Barou as the hangman against Barou's storyline in the Ubers match. In the main story, we got worrying parallels between Barou and Mick, insinuating that Barou might also be at risk of suicide. Or as another example, the episode Nagi chapter with Nagi and Barou facing off against Isagi's Phantom was published in February 2025, right around the time that BM vs PXG was wrapping in the main story. This means that we'd already been exposed to Rin being haunted by Sai's Phantom in the main story, directly inviting comparison between the two scenes. I could talk about all this at length, but I'm digressing. Point being, episode Nagi is filled to the brim with dramatic irony if you read it against the eventual tragic dissolution of Nagi and Reo's relationship, or at least as far as current manga events are concerned. To list just some examples, there's a scene of Nagi wondering if he would look like Naruhaya if he gets eliminated from Blue Lock. Then there's Hiragi's tarot reading, and later the scene of Ego discussing how a prodigy loses their glow. Now, I could hypothesize about how the spin-off foreshadows Nagi's eventual return in the main story or something to that effect, but this is an interpretation of episode Nagi, not a theory video. So instead, let's talk about the dark shadow that looms over the entire spin-off and how that fundamentally shapes our interpretation of the events therein. Of all major characters, Nagi has perhaps the most ambivalent visual metaphor. Or maybe I should be saying aura, to fit in with my fellow kids. In all honesty, I still don't feel like I've grasped the full significance of Nagi's association with death. Nevertheless, it's undeniable that episode Nagi as a whole is permeated with this concept. In its opening pages, we already see our protagonist mercilessly culling off enemies in his video game, like a god reigning over lowly mortals. Or when Reo realizes that he's been suppressing Nagi's dream, he begs for someone to kill him. Soon after, Nagi answers his prayers and grants his partner the sweet kiss of death. 2 chapters later, the spin-off stops being subtle and just spells it out. In Hiragi's tarot reading, Nagi represents death. If you're interested, I actually discussed the various interpretations of this scene in detail in a dedicated video, and with Nagi's elimination, it gains even further layers of significance. But if all of that is still not enough, Ego's final speech in the spin-off is about how humans are distinguished from other animals because they are aware, uniquely, of their own mortality. His final pearls of wisdom in the spin-off are about finding meaning by staring death in the face. This is a video about episode Nagi as an intensely intertextual work of art, and the theme of death is perhaps the ultimate example of how our familiarity with the main story imbues the spin-off with profound levels of additional meaning. At its core, episode Nagi is a story about relationships and separation. On a structural level, its 2 halves represent a yin and yang of sorts. The first half is a story of how Nagi gradually develops passions and desires, culminating in him stepping out of Reo's shadow and asserting himself as an independent egoist. The second half then sees him learn about himself and develop his individual skills, which conversely deepens his sense of connection with Reo. The last chapter of the spin-off then insinuates that the 2 are now finally able to enter a healthy partnership, where they elevate each other through mutual respect and understanding. However, as a reader of episode Nagi, you are presumably aware that this partnership would eventually crumble apart and result in Nagi's elimination from Blue Lock, leaving him broken and alone. So in that sense, I don't think it's a coincidence that death is a persistent motif throughout the spin-off. After all, the entire story is essentially nothing more than the prelude to a doomed relationship. With that in mind, let's examine Ego's speech about the fear of death one more time. In terms of story structure, the speech is positioned at a pivotal moment in the story, right after Nagi is filled with an overwhelming urge to reunite with Reo. That's when Ego reminds us that death is always nearby, with Nagi's signature skull lurking in the shadows. In other words, the sequence of events in the spin-off strongly implies that Nagi's newfound desire will ultimately seal his fate, as has been confirmed by the main story. Yet despite its macabre subject and imagery, Ego's speech is far from nihilistic. At its heart, its message is about creating meaning in the face of the finality of life, about how we can only dream because we know that the end is nigh. And what I want to argue here is that on a metatextual level, this extends to us readers as well. Why should you care about a story focusing on Nagi and Reo's relationship, given that they will just be driven apart down the line? It's because death, figurative or literal, gives meaning to our mortal struggles. And yet, while episode Nagi is suffused with the concept of death, it really doesn't end there. Remember how I mentioned earlier that spin-off Reo begs to be killed towards the end of the 3v3? In the main story, this scene is focalized from Nagi's POV. At least, that seems to be the implication by the way the flashback perfectly underscores Nagi's words. Here, Nagi is visualized as the Grim Reaper, mercilessly delivering the fatal blow. However, in the spin-off, the framing is markedly different. This time around, we get to witness the exact same events from Reo's perspective. Yet despite Reo's desire to be offed, his subsequent death is actually depicted as a release, a dissipation of the blackness that had tainted his heart. As we discover in the spin-off, Reo had to be killed in order to grow. In fact, this is really interesting in light of my observations earlier in this video about the parallels between Barou and Reo in the 3v3. During Barou's awakening, Reo realizes that he lacks the courage to destroy himself, in contrast to his opponent. In the main story, Barou similarly states that his old self died during the match, but that he's brave enough to change and come back stronger. And during the NEL, he actually derides Nagi in very similar terms. Nagi is still a coward who must die and come back to life. Point being, both the imagery in the spin-off and the comparison to Barou make it clear that Nagi figuratively killing Reo was an act of mercy, a welcome stab through the heart through which his friend could be reborn. Jinpachi Ego describes the second selection as a test designed to evoke the fear of death, one where the ever-present risk of elimination forces the Blue Lock candidates to change and adapt. Yet, that's only one half the story, isn't it? The second selection is also a tale about our protagonists dying over and over again, and every time we get the exact same conclusion. There is life after death. In fact, this idea is central to perhaps the most transformative moment of Nagi's life. In the finale of the first selection, Nagi haunts Isagi as the avatar of death, ready to deliver the killing blow. But instead, he lays eyes on something he'd never seen before. Isagi's radiant light blinded out the darkness, in a moment that defied, that transcended death itself. Right here, Nagi bore witness to a person being born anew. This is the experience that Nagi chases after for the rest of the spin-off. In the rematch against Rin, he almost manages to generate the fire to be reborn, only for Isagi to steal away his heat once again. And when Nagi enters his final 4v4, he swears that this will be his moment of rebirth, and bring him one step closer to Isagi. So let me turn back to the relationship between the spin-off and the main story. As I hope to have convinced you, episode Nagi as a whole is steeped in the concept of death, and that motif is inseparably linked to our knowledge that this is a story about a doomed relationship. So then, what's the point of producing an entire spin-off to meticulously document these events? It's for episode Nagi to tell us that death is nothing but a new beginning. In fact, this very idea is demonstrated in a moment of sublime reversal, where the relationship between main and secondary text folds in on itself. Nagi's first appearance after his elimination from Blue Lock is a panel-by-panel recreation of the opening pages of episode Nagi. So if Nagi declared towards the end of the spin-off that he never wants to leave the dream that is Blue Lock, his eventual elimination forcefully wakes him up to reality, in a very literal sense, back to the monotonous tedium that characterized his life before meeting Reo. So on a metatextual level, episode Nagi itself has been reborn, subsumed into the main story that it had once branched off from, right after the figurative death of its protagonist. It's as if episode Nagi is leaving behind one final message. Every ending, even the ending of the story itself, is merely a fresh start. Before I let you go, I want to zoom out one last time. I previously talked about how Blue Lock and episode Nagi have their protagonists undergo an analogous process, but that the story have them do so through wildly divergent means. I would argue that the same is true about the concept of death and rebirth. Episode Nagi is a story about interpersonal connections, which is why its entire dramatic structure is woven around the demise of Nagi and Reo's partnership and their path to reconciliation. The narrative of Blue Lock, on the other hand, is also a tale of death and rebirth, but this time on the level of Japanese football as a whole. It's the story about the birth of an extraordinary striker who can demolish the status quo and rejuvenate the nation. Once again, Blue Lock and episode Nagi are two sides of the same coin. That's it for this time. I realize that there are countless points of contact between the two manga that I could have also discussed, and I fully expect half the comments of this video to be deriding me for ignoring some obvious parallel, but, well, all good things come to an end. In all honesty, this might have been the most difficult video for me to write ever since I started the channel, mostly coming down to me struggling to figure out how to even tackle this topic. But in the end, I'm really pleased where I landed. And I also hope that I've given you all some new appreciation for episode Nagi and challenged you to take the relationship between main story and spin-off more seriously. Also, just to be upfront, I kinda expect that I won't be as prolific in my uploads in the foreseeable future. That's partly because my next projects are mostly longer videos. That includes the second part of the episode Nagi analysis and an analysis of the France match once that comes to a close. But also, I just want to dedicate some more time to my personal and professional life going forwards. That being said, I still really love writing about Blue Lock and don't see myself stopping anytime soon, so please don't worry about that. And before I let you go, I want to express my gratitude to my €10 patrons who kept supporting me during the past months. Alex Mackay, BW, JKI, Liam Dunseith, Melody, and Orangey Legend. If every dream is followed by an eventual awakening, I hope that I can keep slumbering a bit longer. So until next time, Slán go fóill.